The light strip above bin 40 had been dead for 17 years. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters to me. 17 years, 4 months, and 11 days, because I remember reporting it, and I remember the date of the maintenance ticket, and I remember the date the ticket was closed without action, and I remember the date I submitted a second ticket, and the date that one was closed without action, and the date I decided I was done submitting tickets about a light strip that didn't affect my productivity in any measurable way. I have a memory for numbers like that. It's what makes a good quartermaster, and it's what makes for poor dinner conversation, and I made my peace with both of those things somewhere around year 3 aboard way station Helsin 4. Helsin 4 was not a glamorous posting. I want to be clear about that too, because some of the accounts that came out afterward painted the station as something grander than it was: a strategic node, a critical resupply hub, a linchpin of the outer rim logistics chain. All of those things were technically true. They were also true of approximately 14 other way stations in the same supply corridor, none of which anyone had ever written a commendation about. Helsin 4 was a way station. It had a medical bay, 3 crew decks, a communications cluster, an engineering section, and a supply hold on Deck 9 that was my responsibility, and for 17 years and 4 months and 11 days, my primary occupation. The supply hold was approximately 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, with ceilings high enough to accommodate a small loader, which we had, and lighting in 3 banks, of which 2.5 functioned reliably. The dead strip was the one running the length of bin row 4, the bin designation for shelf units 40 through 49. It had gone out during a minor power fluctuation in month 7 of my second year and never come back on, and after the ticket situation I had simply adapted. Row 4 was cold storage, Type 4 ration canisters, environmental supplement packs, emergency medical bulk, and I had no reason to spend time there in the light of day doing anything that required sight when I could do it in the dark by touch instead. This sounds more dramatic than it was. A Type 4 ration canister is a cylinder 17 centimeters tall and 8 centimeters in diameter, made of a pressed composite material that is slightly rough to the touch, rough enough that the station foundry could emboss a 9-character alphanumeric batch code in raised lettering on the base rim without it being worn smooth by handling. The code format was always the same: 3 letters, a hyphen, 1 digit, a hyphen, 5 letters or letters and numbers, in a font with sufficiently distinct tactile profiles between characters that a person with normal fingertip sensitivity could learn to read them by touch in a matter of weeks. I had learned to read them by touch in a matter of days, because I was bored and the alternative was submitting another maintenance ticket. The batch code told you when and where the canister was produced, what production run it belonged to, and whether the seal had been factory tested or field qualified. The last 2 characters carried the most logistical weight. A factory-tested seal was rated for 3 years of standard storage. A field-qualified seal was rated for 18 months. If you confused them, you might log a canister as viable when it wasn't, or pull a canister for consumption 4 months ahead of its actual expiry, either of which created cascade errors in the resupply schedule that I had to spend the following 6 weeks untangling. I had untangled exactly that kind of cascade error in my first year, before I learned to read the codes by feel, and I had no interest in untangling it again. So I learned the codes, and I did row 4's nightly inventory by feel, standing in the dark with my tablet braced against my left forearm and my right thumb moving from base to base, calling codes aloud and logging them as I went. It was a habit so old it had stopped feeling like a habit. It was just what I did in the dark, alone, in row 4 of Helsin 4's supply hold, every night for 17 years. I had been doing it for so long that I had developed a pace. 42 seconds per bin under normal conditions. That was the time it took me to pull each canister forward to the edge of its shelf, read the base, speak the code, log it, and push it back. 42 seconds times 10 bins in row 4 times the number of canisters per bin which varied by resupply cycle but averaged 38. I could do the full row 4 inventory in approximately 27 minutes. I had done it faster, 24 minutes once, when I was in a poor mood and the supply shuttle was late, and I needed to finish before the second crew rotation began. And I had done it slower, up to 31 minutes on nights when I lingered over a particular canister, whose batch code had a discrepancy I needed to cross-reference. What I mean when I say the pace was 42 seconds is that the 42 seconds had become embodied. I did not count the time. I did not watch the clock. My body knew the interval the way a trained runner knows her stride, not as a calculation but as a physical fact, the particular rhythm of reach, read, speak, log, replace, step, that had been repeated so many times it had stopped requiring active attention. I had read in my second year that skilled manual workers develop a kind of muscle architecture around their habitual movements, physical encoding of the task, stored in the body below the level of conscious direction. I had thought about that a great deal over the years in row 4. What was stored in me by 17 years of blind inventory was a very precise map of a dark room, the position of every shelf, the height of every bin, the slight difference in texture between a full canister and one with a failed seal whose internal pressure had dropped, the particular way the cold air from the refrigerated units in bins 46 and 47 moved across the skin of my forearm as I passed. The dark was not empty to me, it was full. I had filled it one canister at a time over 17 years. I have tried since the inquiry to explain to people what the tactile reading of a batch code actually feels like, not the mechanical process of it, but the phenomenology, the quality of the information as it arrives. The closest analogy I have found is reading a familiar typeface in very dim light. There is a moment where the letters stop being individual strokes and become words, where the recognition is holistic rather than sequential. After a few hundred repetitions, reading a canister base by touch was like that. I did not identify QRT, then the hyphen, then 7, then another hyphen, then the production run identifier. I identified the whole shape of a code the way you identify a face, not by cataloging its features, but by recognizing the pattern all at once. A factory seal code had a particular rhythm under the thumb that was distinguishable from a field-qualified code before I had consciously parsed a single character. I knew the code before I knew that I knew it. This is what the Vethelar tactical briefings did not and could not have anticipated. It is also, I suspect, the reason the infiltration team leader wrote entity either lacks standard sensory architecture rather than entity is using an alternative sensory method. Because the second framing would have raised a different set of questions. What method? How developed? And critically, how much of the whole does it cover? Those questions might have led somewhere more useful to them. The first framing let them classify me as an anomaly and move on. Anomalies are comfortable. They have their own operational category. An anomaly means the general rule still holds, and one exception doesn't change the analysis. I am telling you all of this because it is the most important context for everything that happened afterward, and because the official inquiry's final report made it sound as if I had performed some deliberate act of courage in the supply hold that night, when what I actually did was my job. The Vethelar. I should say something about the Vethelar, since most people who have read accounts of that period have only the military briefings to go on, and military briefings have a way of describing an enemy in terms of what they do rather than what they are. What the Vethelar did was deploy the hemisphere darkfield. What they were, as I came to understand it from the xenobiology summary that was forwarded to all non-military personnel on the station 12 days before the event, was a species whose primary sensory apparatus was not eyes in the way we mean them, but an extraordinarily sensitive array of photoreceptive organs distributed across the upper body surface. Essentially, every centimeter of their dorsal skin perceived light, at resolutions and in spectra that made conventional vision look like reading through wax paper. They saw the way we breathe. It was not something they did. It was something they were. The xenobiology summary went into some detail about what this meant for their evolutionary history. A species that perceives light with its entire body surface does not develop in the same ecological niches as a species with frontal binocular vision. The Vethalar had evolved in an environment of extreme photon variability, vast open plains where the angle and intensity of light changed rapidly across the day cycle, predators that used shadow and silhouette rather than motion as their primary hunting cues, seasonal cycles that brought weeks of near-continuous cloud cover and weeks of unbroken high-intensity illumination. Every component of their sensory architecture had been shaped by the need to process light not as a directional signal from two focal points, but as a total body environmental constant. Their navigational understanding, their spatial mapping, their social communication, all of it was woven through with light reading in a way that had no precise human analog. And what you get, when the species that perceives light the way we breathe also develops a civilization and then a military, is a species that, somewhere in its long technological history, invests enormous resources in learning to take light away from other people. Because if seeing is breathing, then darkness is suffocation. And if you can make your enemy suffocate without touching them, why would you do anything else? The hemisphere darkfield was their answer to that question. In practical terms, it was an electromagnetic pulse weapon that operated in a frequency band specifically tuned to suppress photon emission in visible and near-visible spectra across a roughly 2-kilometer radius. It didn't destroy light sources. It didn't burn out circuits or break filaments. It simply made light sources stop producing light. Every electroluminescent panel, every bioluminescent indicator, every directed energy emitter in the suppressed range, for as long as the pulse sustained. The duration was variable. The shortest documented deployment had been 11 minutes. The longest, in the assault on Kethavar Station 6 months before Helsin 4, had been 4 hours and 17 minutes. The Vethalar had used it to take 6 stations in the Outer Rim corridor in the space of 18 months. 6 stations, 0 armed resistance, 91% non-combatant casualty rate in the first 40 minutes of each engagement. Casualty meaning serious injury, not death, though 2 of the Kethavar station crew had died from fall-related injuries in the dark. The pattern was consistent. Deploy the darkfield, wait for the lights to go out, send in the infiltration teams to secure the command and communications decks, and accept the surrender of a station that had been blinded into helplessness before anyone had time to adjust. I knew all of this. It was in the xenobiology summary and in the 3 follow-up threat briefings that came through in the weeks afterward. I read them. I am a thorough person. I flagged the sections I thought were relevant to supply hold operations, which were mostly the sections about the darkfield's effect on electronic tablets, and whether my inventory logging system would remain functional during a pulse event. The answer, it turned out, was yes, because the tablet used a passive display e-ink screen and a battery-powered processor that operated entirely below the suppressed frequency band, and none of that information changed anything about what I did or planned to do. I was a quartermaster. My job was to know what was in the supply hold at all times. That did not change based on the tactical situation. I did think briefly about the row 4 dead strip. I thought about it the way you think about something that suddenly seems relevant in a new context, a detail that has been in the background of your life for years, and which a new piece of information has moved to the foreground. If the darkfield suppressed all photon sources in visible and near-visible spectra, and if the dead strip had been producing 0 photons for 17 years, then the dead strip was, in a narrow technical sense, already darkfield compliant. I noted this thought. I did not do anything with it because there was nothing to do. Row 4 was dark. It would remain dark. I had a Tuesday inventory to prepare for. The night of the Helsin 4 darkfield event was a Tuesday, which mattered to me because Tuesday nights were the nights I did the full row 4 inventory rather than the spot check I ran on other nights. The full inventory, all 412 canisters across 10 bins, took roughly 45 minutes end to end, including the time to walk the length of the row and the time to cross-reference any discrepancies against the master log. I had started at 2200 hours, which was standard, which put me at bin 43 when the lights went out. They didn't flicker. I want to correct that detail, because several of the witness accounts I've read since describe the lights going out with a flicker or a surge or some other cinematic precursor. There was nothing like that. The lights simply stopped. Every bank in the supply hold, the 2.5 functional ones, and the dead strip above row 4 that had been dead for 17 years, went from their normal state to zero simultaneously with no transition. The emergency lighting strips along the floor seams, which ran on a separate circuit and were supposed to activate automatically in a power interruption, also did not activate because the darkfield suppressed them as efficiently as it suppressed everything else. I was standing in front of bin 43 when it happened. My right thumb was on the base of canister 31. I had already called the code, QRT7DELPHIN-031, and logged it, and I was pushing the canister back to its position on the shelf. The last thing I saw was the slight amber glow of my tablet screen, which was on the e-ink passive display and therefore unaffected, and which showed the inventory log cursor blinking at entry 31 of bin 43. Then there was no light, and the supply hold was completely dark, and I stood there for approximately 3 seconds and thought, well, this is probably the Vethalar. I want to pause on those 3 seconds, because they represent the full extent of my response to the tactical situation. 3 seconds. I was not calm in some composed and decisive way. I was not afraid. I was, if I am honest, faintly irritated, the way you are irritated when something inconvenient happens at a predictable time, after you have been told it might happen, and you realize that the telling did not actually prepare you for the reality. The darkfield briefings had said, you will not be able to see. They had not conveyed what it was like for every photon in a 40-meter room to vanish simultaneously, without the graduated dark adaptation that comes from dimming or dusk. The dark was not darkness the way a room is dark when you turn the light off. It was an absence so total that after 3 seconds I could not tell whether my eyes were open. I touched my eyelids to check. They were open. The difference between this dark and the dark of row 4 was difficult to articulate, but I knew it the moment it arrived. Row 4's dark was the dark I had made habitable. I had spent 17 years filling it with my own architecture, the shelf heights and the canister positions and the cold air gradient and the particular acoustic return of the space, the way a voice calling a batch code sounded against the composite shelving versus the open-air space of the central aisle. It was my dark. It was furnished. This was a different dark. This was row 4's dark extended to cover the entire station, and the entire station was not row 4. The station had corridors I did not know at this level of intimacy, rooms I used with my eyes fully functional, crew members I had never needed to locate by sound. The dark of the station was very large and very sudden, and I was not prepared for it the way I was prepared for the dark of the row. But I was in the row, not in the corridors, not in the rooms I used with my eyes. I was standing with my right thumb 3 centimeters from the shelf edge of bin 43, and the canister I had just logged was at position 31, and there were 7 more to go in this bin. I reached back to bin 43, picked up canister 32, read the base with my thumb and kept going. QRT7DELPHIN-032, factory seal, good for 14 more months. QRT7DELPHIN-033, factory seal, good for 14 months. QRT7DELPHIN-034, field qualified, good for 8 months. I made a note to flag it for priority rotation. The thing about doing a job by feel is that the absence of light does not change the feel. The canister in my hand was the same canister it had always been. The embossed letters under my thumb were the same letters. The shelf was at the same height it had always been, and the canisters were in the same positions I had placed them during the last resupply cycle. And my feet knew the floor of row for the way they know the floor of a house you've lived in for 20 years. Not by looking, but by the particular way the sole of your boot reads the seam between the composite panels at the base of bin 43, and the slight ridge on the floor 7 steps down where a loader had clipped the seam years ago. And the faint drop in temperature that meant you were passing bin 46 and its refrigerated supplement packs. I was on canister 38 of bin 43, the last one, when I heard the door. Not the main supply hold door, which was a powered roll-aside on the western wall. The maintenance access panel on the eastern wall, the one that connected to the tertiary service corridor on deck 9. It was a panel I had submitted a maintenance ticket about in year 6, when the catch mechanism had started making a sound like someone clearing their throat whenever it was opened from the outside. The ticket had been closed without action. The catch still made the sound. It made the sound now. I did not stop moving. I logged canister 38 of bin 43, placed it back on the shelf, moved 7 steps down the row, reached for bin 44 and picked up canister 1. QRT7 DELPHIN cross 001 through QRT7 DELPHIN cross 040 in that bin, 40 canisters, which was one of the larger bins. I knew this. I had logged this bin 192 times in 17 years. What I heard from the direction of the maintenance panel was difficult to characterize, because I had no reference for it. There was movement, the particular kind of movement that comes from something large and careful, something that was trying not to make noise and was not entirely succeeding. The floor in the maintenance corridor was the same composite panel construction as the supply hold, and the Vethalar, based on the xenobiology summary, massed between 90 and 140 kilograms in their combat loadout. The panels gave slightly under that kind of weight. Not much, but in total silence, in a room where I had spent 17 years learning the acoustic signature of every surface, I could hear it. There were at least 2 of them, possibly 3. I was not certain of the third. I called QRT7 DELPHIN cross 001 and logged it and moved on. I should explain something about the calling aloud habit, since it was the detail that seemed to cause the most consternation in the inquiry and in the accounts that circulated afterward. I called the codes aloud because it reduced transcription errors. When I first started doing the blind inventory in the early months after I gave up on the light strip ticket, I had tried logging silently, reading the code by touch, entering it on the tablet, moving on. I made errors. Not many, but some, and in a supply log some is too many. I found that verbalizing the code, actually saying it out loud in the empty row in the dark, forced a second cognitive pass through the information, which caught the errors before they reached the log. So I did it, every night, alone in row 4, calling codes to no one. I was still doing it, I was just no longer alone. QRT7 DELPHIN cross 002, factory seal, fine. QRT7 DELPHIN cross 003, factory seal, fine. I heard the movement stop. The careful footsteps, if that is the right word for whatever the Vethalar do with their forward locomotion appendages on a composite floor, stopped somewhere in the region of bin 41, which put them 8 or 9 meters away from me. I could hear something that was not quite breathing. The xenobiology summary had noted that the Vethalar's respiratory system was largely internal, with minimal surface respiration. What I was hearing was probably the faint mechanical sound of their combat equipment, the pressure-regulated joints of whatever tactical gear they wore. QRT7 DELPHIN cross 004, factory seal. QRT7 DELPHIN cross 005, field qualified, second one tonight. I added it to the priority rotation note. I thought about what I knew of the Vethalar's tactical approach in station environments. The briefings had been clear on this. They moved to the command deck first, communications second, then engineering. The supply hold was not in their operational playbook. Or rather, it was in their playbook only insofar as a cleared supply hold was a secure space, which meant they would send a team to confirm it was empty before they consolidated their hold on the station. They were not there to fight. They were there to verify that the room was unoccupied and report back. I was making that very difficult for them. QRT-7 DLPHIN Cross 006, Factory Seal. I heard movement again. Closer now, not footsteps, but the faint rustle of something adjusting position. They were trying to locate me. In the dark, in a room where a human being was standing 17 centimeters in front of an open bin, calling alphanumeric codes into the air at conversational volume every 42 seconds, and apparently showing no awareness that anything unusual had happened. I finished canister 6 and picked up canister 7. The thing that would not have occurred to them, the thing that could not have been in their operational briefings, because there was no reason for it to be, was that a portion of this room had been in total darkness for 17 years before their weapon arrived. The darkfield was not doing anything to row 4 that the dead light strip had not already done. Row 4 was row 4, dark or light. The canisters were in the same places they had always been, and my hands knew them, and the only variable that the Vethalar had introduced to my evening was the faint sound of careful movement from the direction of bin 41. QRT-7 DLPHIN Cross 007, Factory Seal. There was a sound I did not recognize, not movement, a vocalization, or what might have been a vocalization high-pitched and brief, somewhere in the range my ears barely caught. Then silence. QRT-7 DLPHIN Cross 008, Factory Seal. I had been in enough tense situations, mostly involving resupply schedule disputes with the logistics coordinator on the adjacent way station, which is exactly as undramatic as it sounds, but which had a particular quality of controlled hostility that I recognized as a version of what I was experiencing now. To know that my body was doing things independently of my decision to keep working. My pulse was up. My hands were entirely steady, because my hands were always steady when I was working, a steadiness I had developed not through training but through repetition, the same way the pace was 42 seconds. My hands did not know how to shake during inventory. It was not a quality I had consciously cultivated. It was simply what 17 years of precise manual work had made of them. But I was aware of a particular quality of attention, a way that the dark had changed texture, that I associated with the presence of something I should probably be paying more attention to than I was. I noted it. I logged canister 8 and moved to canister 9. QRT-7 DLPHIN Cross 009, Factory Seal. The footsteps started again. This time they did not stop at bin 41. They came closer, close enough that I could hear the pressure joint sound more clearly, and something else, a faint click that repeated at irregular intervals, which I later learned was a component of the Vethalar's sensory relay equipment, a sonar-adjacent system they used when their primary photoreceptive sense was unavailable. The darkfield suppressed everything in visible and near-visible spectra. It did not suppress acoustic bounce detection, which meant the Vethalar were not entirely blind in the dark. They were operating at a fraction of their normal sensory capacity, dependent on sound reflection mapping instead of their distributed photoreceptive array. And they were doing it in a room whose acoustic profile included a human being who was calmly announcing her position every 42 seconds. QRT-7 DLPHIN Cross 010, Factory Seal, last canister of the first row in bin 44. I moved to the second row, 20 more canisters, 20 more times 42 seconds. The footsteps stopped again. Close now, close enough that I could, if I thought about it, estimate the distance. 3 meters, give or take, slightly to my right in the direction of bin 43. which I had already finished. I did not turn toward the sound. Turning would have moved my thumb off the base of canister 11, which I had already positioned, and I would have had to find it again, which would have broken my pace and introduced the possibility of a misread. QRT7 Delphin Cross 011, Factory Seal. I became aware, in the way you become aware of a change in air pressure or temperature, that something was very close to me. Not from sound, I had lost the footsteps, but from a sense of displacement, a quality of the air that was different in a way I could not account for by logic alone. I registered it the way you register the feeling of being watched in a room you thought was empty. I did not find this particularly useful information, because the only thing I could do with it was stop working, which I was not going to do, or keep working, which I was already doing. QRT7 DELPHIN Cross 012, Factory Seal. QRT7 DELPHIN Cross 013, Factory Seal. There was a sound very close to my left ear. I cannot describe it better than to say it was something between an exhalation and a mechanical click, and it lasted perhaps 1 second, and it was the only moment during the entire event that I was genuinely uncertain whether I would finish the inventory. Not because I was afraid of the Vethalar soldier who was standing approximately 2 feet to my left in the total dark. I was afraid that I would drop canister 14, which I was holding, and which, if it hit the floor, would dent the base rim and make the batch code unreadable by touch. The thought that I might have to flag a canister as a legible base and resolve it by physical measurement of its position in the bin and cross-reference to the intake manifest was, in that moment, more immediately distressing than the thing breathing next to me. I did not drop the canister. QRT7 DELPHIN Cross 014, Factory Seal. The sound did not repeat. Whatever had made it, whoever had made it, did not make it again. After perhaps 30 seconds, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from me, back toward the direction of bin 41, and then further toward the maintenance panel. Then the sound of the catch mechanism, clearing its throat, and then nothing. I kept going. QRT7 DELPHIN Cross 015, Factory Seal. QRT7 DELPHIN Cross 016, Field Qualified, Third Priority Rotation Flag. I am aware of how this reads. I am aware that in the accounts that came out afterward, and in the inquiry, and in the one brief conversation I had with the station's senior security officer 2 days after the event, the consistent response to the description of what I had been doing was a version of, "But how did you stay calm?" And my honest answer, which I gave each time and which was received with something between admiration and bewilderment, was that I had not experienced anything that I identified as requiring calm. The Vethalar had entered the supply hold, located me, and left. The inventory needed to be finished. Those two facts had existed simultaneously without one canceling the other. I do not want to sound as if I am being falsely modest about the experience, because it was not nothing. It was not a pleasant 17 minutes. The period between canister 12 and canister 26 was, I will admit, unpleasant in a way I have not experienced before or since. A kind of sustained attention that left me tired afterward in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work. But it was not fear of the kind the inquiry seemed to expect, because fear of the kind the inquiry seemed to expect would have required me to make a decision about whether to stop working, and I had not made that decision, and I did not make it. The question never came up. It did not come up because the work was concrete, and the work was present, and the work was mine. Every canister I was holding had a specific identity, a batch code, a seal type, a position in a specific bin on a specific shelf, and that identity was accessible to me through my right thumb, and my right thumb was doing its job, and the inventory was proceeding, and there was nothing the Vethalar's darkfield weapon could do to change any of that. The weapon had been designed to suppress the sensory apparatus that its designers depended on. It had no category for a quartermaster who had spent 17 years developing a different one. QRT7 DLPHIN cross 020. Last canister of the second row. I moved to the third row. Bins 45 and 46 were the environmental supplement packs, different dimensions from the canisters, thinner and wider, with a different embossing standard. The batch codes on supplement packs were embossed on the face rather than the base, in a font with slightly smaller character relief. Reading them by touch required a lighter pressure and a slower pass. I had learned this in year 3, after introducing a systematic error rate in supplement pack logging that I spent 6 weeks correcting. The adjustment to my technique was small, a question of how much I loaded the pad of my thumb versus the tip. But it had taken 3 months of practice to make it habitual, and I had not once made the same error since. I worked through bin 45 methodically, 19 supplement packs, each one lifted, read, logged, replaced. The cold from the refrigerated wall behind the bin reached through the shelf material and chilled the back of my wrist. I noted this the way I always noted it. It was information. It meant the refrigeration unit was functioning, which was relevant to the supplement pack viability timeline, which was relevant to the priority rotation schedule. Every sensation in row 4 was, in some sense, data. Bin 46, 21 supplement packs, these ones a newer production variant from the last resupply cycle, with a slightly revised embossing pattern on the batch code face. I had noted the revision during intake. The character spacing was fractionally wider, which changed the tactile reading pace by approximately 2 seconds per pack. I had adapted during the intake log and adapted again now. 2 seconds per pack, times 21 packs, 42 extra seconds in bin 46. I noted this in the log as a variance notation. The hold was quiet. No footsteps from the maintenance panel. No pressure joint sound, no sonar click. Either the team had left, or they were very still somewhere in the hold that was not row 4, or they were watching from a position I could not locate by sound. I did not find any of these possibilities particularly actionable. I finished bin 46 and moved to bin 47, which was the emergency medical bulk sealed compressible packs, a different shape again, with a single raised identification stripe rather than a full batch code. The stripe carried less information than the canister codes, but it was sufficient for inventory purposes. 1 stripe meant standard configuration, 2 stripes meant extended shelf variant, 3 stripes meant expired or quarantine. Bin 47, 16 packs all single stripe, all fine. Bin 48, 12 packs, 11 single stripe, 1 2-stripe that I had flagged at intake and was still in the valid window. Fine. Bin 49, 10 packs, the small count bin at the end of the row that the resupply shuttle always treated as an overflow location. 9 single stripe, 1 with no stripe at all, a production error I had flagged at intake, noted as unreadable face, resolved by cross-reference to the shipment manifest. Still logging correctly. Fine. I finished bin 49's last pack, placed it back and stood in the dark. 412 canisters and 47 supplement packs, plus the medical bulk, all logged. 3 priority rotation flags on field-qualified canisters. 2 batch code discrepancies cross-referenced and resolved. 1 damaged canister base requiring reconstruction. 1 production error supplement pack logging correctly on manifest cross-reference. The hold was quiet. I did not know if the Vethalar were still in it. I had heard no movement in approximately 20 minutes, but absence of sound in a dark room is not reliable evidence of absence of occupant. I had learned this about row 4 before I learned anything else about it. When you cannot see, silence is a provisional condition. It does not mean the room is empty. It means the room is quiet. I set the damaged canister on the floor at the end of row 4 to deal with in the light. Then I sat down on the floor at the far end of the row, with my back against the refrigerated bin of bin 49, which was cold against my shoulder blades, and I waited. I have been asked what I thought about, sitting in the dark. The honest answer is that I thought about the inventory. I thought about the 3 field-qualified seals and whether I should update the priority rotation schedule before morning or wait for the resupply shuttle's manifest, which was due in 11 days and might change the rotation anyway. I thought about the damaged canister on the floor and whether the supply coordinator would accept a notation of illegible base, or whether I would need to weigh it against the production run average to estimate its batch code. I thought about the supplement pack variant discrepancy in bin 46 and whether I needed to flag the fractional character spacing change to the intake coordinator in case it was affecting their logging accuracy as well. I thought briefly about the Vethalar soldier who had stood 2 feet away from me in the total dark and made a sound near my ear, and I thought about what that moment must have been like from the other side. An entity operating on degraded sensory capacity, in a room that should have been paralyzed into stillness, confronted with a human being who was holding a canister in both hands and reading its base with her right thumb and speaking into the dark as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I had read enough of the xenobiology summary to understand what that experience would cost a Vethalar soldier operationally. Their sonar-adjacent relay equipment was functional but coarse, adequate for mapping large spaces and identifying the position of moving objects, inadequate for the kind of fine-grained spatial reading they normally performed through their photoreceptive array. In the darkfield, they were the ones navigating by unfamiliar means. They were the ones working with degraded information and incomplete maps, and what their degraded sensors had shown them was a human who appeared to have suffered no degradation at all, who was moving at a consistent pace, speaking at a consistent volume, handling objects with a precision that their own sensory equipment could not fully account for at this resolution. I thought that it must have been, from their perspective, deeply strange. And I thought good. Not in a triumphant way. Not in the way the accounts afterward seemed to want me to feel about it. The heroic-class defender framing that the security office's summary tried to build around what had been, at its core, a woman finishing her Tuesday inventory in the dark. I thought good because I had, in a small and completely unintentional way, been on the right side of an information asymmetry. The Vethalar knew how to suppress light. They did not know about the light strip above bin 40 that had been dead for 17 years, or about the 42-second pace I could hold by feel alone, or about the 9-character batch codes embossed on the base rim of every Type 4 ration canister in the outer rim logistics chain. They had walked into a room where their primary weapon had already been deployed by accident, a decade and a half before they arrived, and the person who lived in that room had simply continued doing her job. I was sitting on the floor in the cold, thinking about reorder schedules when the lights came back on. They did not flicker back either. The same total absence, and then, simultaneously, every bank in the supply hold at full normal output. The sudden light was briefly painful, the kind of pain that comes not from intensity but from contrast, from pupils dilated for 3 hours and 42 minutes suddenly presented with 3 banks of fluorescent equivalent panels. I sat with my eyes closed for a few seconds, listening to the station around me begin to make its normal sounds again. The ventilation system resuming its low background note, the power indicator on the supply hold's main console cycling through its startup sequence with a series of soft chimes, the distant sound of something mechanical on the deck above. I opened my eyes. The supply hold was exactly as I had left it, every bin in order, every canister in its place. The damaged canister on the floor at the end of row 4 where I had set it. The tablet in my left hand showing the completed row 4 inventory log, cursor blinking at entry 412. I stood up, which took a moment because I had been sitting on a composite floor for nearly 3.5 hours and my lower back had opinions about this. I walked down the row to the damaged canister, picked it up, and carried it to the workbench at the north end of the hold, where I weighed it against the production run average, found it within normal range, and used that data to reconstruct the last 2 characters of its batch code. I noted the reconstruction method in the margin of the log entry, and flagged it for supervisor review, as protocol required. Then I updated the priority rotation schedule to account for the 3 field-qualified SEALs. It was 20 past 2 in the morning. I had been in the supply hold since 10. I gathered my tablet and walked to the main door, and the door opened, and I went to find out what had happened to the rest of the station. The situation on the other decks was, as it turned out, largely what the briefings had predicted. The Vethelar infiltration teams had secured the command deck and communications cluster without significant resistance. The sudden and total darkness had been as disorienting for the station's bridge personnel as the briefings had suggested it would be, and 3 crew members had sustained minor injuries from falls or collisions in the darkened corridors before the attack was acknowledged and the shelter-in-place protocol activated. The engineering section had managed to seal itself behind the secondary blast doors before the infiltration teams reached it, which bought the station 9 hours before a settlement was negotiated. The supply hold was listed in the Vethelar infiltration team's after-action report as cleared, unoccupied, no strategic assets. I read that line 3 times. I found it funny, in the particular way that things are funny when they are precisely wrong in a way that reveals more than the person who wrote them intended. The supply hold had 412 Type 4 ration canisters, each carrying enough nutritional content for 6 standard crew meals. It had 107 environmental supplement packs. It had 42 units of emergency medical bulk that the medical bay would need before the resupply shuttle arrived. It had an entirely complete and accurate inventory log, finished at 22:46 hours before the event, and again at 23:32 during it. No strategic assets. I did not correct the record. It was not my job. Later, weeks later, when the debrief materials came through, and I had time to read the technical analysis of the Helsin 4 event, I learned what the Vethelar infiltration teams had reported about the supply hold encounter. The account was included as an appendix to the military assessment, translated from the Vethelar operational log by the xenolinguistics team at Outer Corridor Command. And it was, in its way, more interesting to me than anything else in the debrief package. The infiltration team leaders report read in translation: supply hold deck 9. Darkfield fully effective. Hold occupied by 1 entity human type. Entity unresponsive to complete light suppression. Entity performing unidentified repeated action with storage containers, vocalizing unknown sequence notation at regular intervals. Duration of observation, 17 minutes. Entity behavior consistent throughout, no response to darkness, no alteration in behavior upon team entry, no response to proximity contact. Assessment: entity either lacks standard sensory architecture or is operating on a pre-existing non-visual task protocol. Hold is not strategically significant. Recommend bypass. I found the phrase lacks standard sensory architecture particularly memorable, not because it was insulting, which it wasn't. It was an accurate operational assessment, but because it was so precisely wrong about what was actually happening, in a way that revealed the gap between what the Vethelar understood about darkness and what I had learned about it. They had never considered that a species might spend 17 years of its working life in the dark and simply get used to it. The possibility, from their perspective, would have required imagining a being for whom light was not a fundamental operating requirement but an optional convenience. Something you could set aside in one specific room, for one specific task, because the task itself did not require it. A being whose hands had become a kind of reading instrument that operated independently of sight. A being who had, through years of small repetitions in a broken room, built a map of the dark that was as accurate and complete as any visual survey. Their biology did not give them a category for this. Their weapons design assumptions did not allow for it. They had built a tool to suppress a sense. And they had built it flawlessly. And they had walked into a room occupied by someone for whom the suppressed sense was not the only one that mattered. In the weeks after the Helsin 4 event, the security office ran a comprehensive review of what had and had not worked during the Vethalar engagement. It was a thorough review, conducted by people who were genuinely trying to understand the encounter, and I gave my account of the supply hold as clearly as I could, including the timeline, the canister count, the number of priority rotation flags, and the reconstruction of the damaged canister's batch code. I answered every question that was asked of me. I did not, to my knowledge, withhold any relevant information. The senior security officer, a man named Korvath who had been on the station for 11 months, and who seemed to be working through a framework for the engagement that did not quite have a slot for what had happened in the supply hold, asked me 3 times, in 3 different ways, why I had continued the inventory. The first time, he framed it as a practical question. Did you not consider evacuating to a safer location? I told him I did not consider it, no. The supply hold was, by the station's shelter-in-place protocol, a designated shelter location for Deck 9 non-essential personnel. I was non-essential personnel. I was already in the shelter location. The second time, he framed it as a safety question. Were you not concerned about the presence of the infiltration team? I told him that concerned was probably the right word for some portion of what I was experiencing. Yes. I had also had a complete and accurate inventory to finish, and the Vethalar had not given any indication of being interested in me, and I saw no reason to abandon the inventory on the basis of an encounter that had not escalated. The third time he stopped framing it and simply asked, why? And I told him the truth, which was that the inventory was due, and I was in the middle of it, and I did not see what the Vethalar had to do with it. He looked at me for a long moment after I said that. I could see him trying to decide how to file this information. He was a thorough and professionally courteous man, and he was clearly working hard to understand what had happened in the supply hold in a way that connected to the framework he used for understanding things that happened in tactical situations. I appreciated the effort. I also suspected, from the look on his face, that he was not going to find a satisfying connection. The supply hold encounter did not fit the framework because the supply hold encounter had not been a tactical event. It had been an inventory. He filed it as an example of situational composure under duress. The supply hold incident was included in a supplementary note to the engagement review under the heading of crew behavioral resilience in non-combat roles. It was 3 paragraphs. The paragraphs were accurate as far as they went, and entirely failed to mention the dead light strip above bin 40 that had been out for 17 years. They also did not mention that I had flagged 3 priority rotation canisters during the event, or that the complete inventory log was uploaded to the station's supply management system at 2332, time-stamped and accurate to the individual unit. I had submitted the log the moment I reached a terminal with network access. It seemed like the relevant thing to do. I did not correct that either. What I did 2 weeks after the event was submit a maintenance ticket. The dead strip above bin row 4, same unit I had reported in year 2 and again in year 3 and then given up on. I submitted the ticket, same as before, describing the fault, noting the location and flagging it as a long-standing issue. I expected it to be closed without action. I had submitted this ticket before. It was completed in 4 days. I suspect Korvath had something to do with that, though he did not say so, and I did not ask. The maintenance record showed that a technician named Fell had replaced the full strip assembly rather than attempting to repair the fault, which was the right call, and one that the original tickets had not specified clearly enough. I made a note to specify assembly replacement rather than fault repair in any future tickets about recurring strip failures. When I came in to do the Tuesday inventory the following week, the strip above row 4 was on. Full output. The row was bright in a way it had not been since the power fluctuation in my second year, and the composite surface of the shelves reflected the light in a way that made everything look, briefly, almost new. I stood at the entrance to the row for a moment, looking at it. I will tell you what I noticed, standing there in the light. I noticed the canisters. Not the labels are stickers and were largely faded after 17 years of cold storage, but the canisters themselves, their particular dull gray composite surface, and the slight irregularity in the base rim embossing that you can see under direct light if you know to look for it. The slightly raised edge of each character. The way the surface of a field-qualified seal has a different sheen from a factory-tested one, visible under direct light, which I had been reading by feel for so long that I had never thought to look. The visual confirmation of a thing I had known for years through a different channel. The way you sometimes hear a word said aloud by someone else and realize you had been pronouncing it slightly wrong in your own head for as long as you had known it. I looked at them for a moment. Then I walked into the row, picked up the first canister of bin 40 and started the inventory. QRT7 DLPHIN Cross 001, factory seal. I said it aloud. The habit was old enough that removing it would have required a conscious decision, and I saw no reason to make that decision. My pace was 42 seconds. The row was bright. The codes were legible. I called each one into the light the same way I had always called them into the dark, because the canister was the same canister, and the code was the same code, and the inventory was the same inventory, and none of that had anything to do with whether the light was on or off. I finished row 4 in 26 minutes and 40 seconds, fastest time in 17 years. The 3 priority rotation flags from the week before had been processed. The damaged canister's log entry showed the reconstruction notation, and the supervisor's sign-off, Korvath had done it himself, which I had not expected. Everything was in order. I logged the last entry, closed the session, and moved on to row 5. There is nothing else to tell, really. Helsin 4 eventually returned to its normal operations after the engagement review was completed, and the settlement terms with the Vethalar Authority were negotiated by people considerably above my pay grade. I was not involved in those negotiations. I was not asked to participate in the subsequent tactical review sessions, which were classified at a level above my clearance, although I was told that the supply hold encounter had been included as a data point. A data point. I found that characterization accurate. The station resumed its resupply schedule. The supply hold on Deck 9 continued to receive, store, and rotate the same canisters, packs, and bulk medical supplies it had always received. I continued to do the full row 4 inventory on Tuesday nights, at 2200 hours, at 42 seconds per canister, calling every code aloud in a bright and fully lit row, because the habit was the habit, and the light strip was fixed and the inventory was due. The Vethalar darkfield events continued in the Outer Rim corridor for another 11 months, until the tactical counter was developed. A resonance band emitter, deployed in the weeks leading up to an expected engagement, that tuned the station's photon sources to operate on a frequency outside the darkfield suppression range. It was not an elegant solution. It was expensive to deploy, took significant engineering time to calibrate, and required a forward warning period that was not always available. But it worked, and after the counter was deployed across the Outer Rim chain, the darkfield events stopped, and the Vethalar moved on to other approaches. I read about the resonance band counter in the unclassified summary that was circulated to all station personnel. I noted the engineering principles involved, the calibration parameters, and the forward warning period requirements. I thought about submitting a comment to the review board noting that a passive, zero-cost, zero-maintenance alternative had been available for 17 years in the form of a broken light strip on Deck 9. But I did not, because it would not have been useful. And because the resonance band counter worked across all decks rather than just one dark row of cold storage. And because there was no operational value in pointing out that the Vethalar's weapon had, in one room on one-way station, met a 17-year-old maintenance failure and found it impenetrable. The next Tuesday at 2200 hours, I walked into the supply hold, turned on the lights, and started the inventory. QRT7 DLPHIN X 001. Factory seal. Good.